Well, thank you again so much for joining me. Today we'll be talking about the benefits of the Cambridge cluster. My name is Dr. Monique Boddington. I am a research associate in the Entrepreneurship Centre with a specific specialty in the research on the lean startup around subjects like pivoting, but also with an interest in gender and entrepreneurship and really focusing on very early stage ventures. And the other half of my job is as lead program supervisor on the Cambridge Judge Launchpad. I deal with a lot of the kind of online content side of things. And the Cambridge cluster is something that I've become very, very interested in over time. And I'm really looking forward to talking a little bit about the cluster and about what the cluster can benefit you with. So hopefully, starting slides. So I first wanted to start with just giving you a little bit of an idea about the size of the cluster and the nature of the cluster. Now, one of the things, this is from a survey of companies from 2015, 2016, so it's still quite up to date, but a lot of these figures have grown. And what we see is that we have a lot of very knowledge intensive firms. And this is a real key characteristic of the cluster. So over 4,500 knowledge-intensive firms employing 60,000 people with an annual revenue turnover of $12 billion. I think one of the statistics I always quite looking at is the number of patents. And while not an accurate, completely demonstration of innovation, it's a good signal of kind of the quantity of innovation happening within the cluster. And we see that, compared to anywhere else in the UK, it has the highest patent applications published per 100,000 residents. In fact, it's actually more than the next 4 cities combined, including London. So we see that within a university innovation ecosystem, it is very much this knowledge-intensive firms that is driving the cluster. So something worth thinking. If we break it down a little bit more, what else can we see? We can see that there is a very high-tech characteristic to the cluster. So we see high-tech manufacturing, and also, which is actually growing probably at the fastest rate, is the life sciences and healthcare companies, over 430 plus. But the real concentration and the focus is on the information technology and communication companies. And this is also the area where we see the most success stories, the biggest success stories. And I'm going to go a little bit of detail into one of those. So looking at the context of the cluster, we see 2 things straight away really obviously glaring out at us. One, it's very knowledge intensive, it's very innovative, and also it's very much clustered around this tech industry. In terms of growth, the cluster has actually been growing for about 7% per year for about the last decade. Even during the last recession, actually, Cambridge didn't experience so much of a dip, and we've seen continued growth year on year. But to truly understand the cluster, I always think it's a really, really good idea to look back at the history of a place, to see how it grew into what we know of it today. So one of the stories that I've always liked is the idea of, who was Cambridge's first entrepreneur? Where did it all begin? And to find that, we need to go back to the 19th century. And this gentleman here on the screen, where my pointer is Horace Darwin. He's in fact Charles Darwin's son. And he started a company in 1881 called Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company. The idea is pretty simple. We have a lot of scientists in Cambridge. They need scientific instruments. So he would manufacture, produce, and sell the instruments to the university. The story goes that Horace Darwin, despite his kind of entrepreneurial motivations, wasn't actually a very good businessman, and the company never really grew or took off on a big scale outside the industry. in a way. There's also stories that actually it was his wife that was the business brains, and he was more just interested in the kind of technology, probably your first modern day CTO, in fact. So they manufactured instruments and continued right into the 20th century. The instrument in the middle, this one in fact, unbelievably was still being made right into the 1970s and still being used by scientists. It's a rocking microtone. I actually had to Google what it did, as I'm not a specialist in this area, but it's for actually cutting tissue samples, whether this is plant or human tissue, for taking in those little kind of samples to go under the microscope. The company continued right up until the 1980s, but is now unfortunately defunct. So looking back in history, what we see originally is the idea that we've got people taking inspiration from the university, coming out of the university, setting up companies that are working around the scientific research going on within the university. Taking a second example, and what I really like about this example is how many times this company reinvented itself. It evolved as external things going on in the world evolved and changed. The gentleman there sitting on your right is William Pye. He actually was the superintendent at the Cavendish Laboratories. He worked there in the 19th century, but in 1896 decided to leave the Cavendish Laboratories. For those of you who don't know, it's just down the road from where I'm sitting right now, and is very famous for actually some of the most cutting edge research of the last kind of 150 years. It was where the electro was originally discovered. So he set up this company in 1896. Originally manufacturing high precision scientific instruments, a bit like Horace Darwin, in fact. But over time grew and changed direction. With the onset of World War I, there was actually a bit of a drop in demand for scientific instruments. And we see the company changing direction and actually going into the manufacturing of military equipment. At the end of the First World War, we see a shift again. We see the business slowed, and actually they went into wireless receivers, an up-and-coming technology. And by the 1930s, were manufacturing over 40,000 a year. Again, we see one final pivot with the fall of the wireless. They went into TV sets and became one of the leading early manufacturer and distributors of TVs in the country. But again, unfortunately, with the onset of new technologies in the 1970s, and also with some management issues, they finally went out of business in the 1970s, being bought out by Philips. In some ways, the story of Pye does live on. Some of the knowledge and some of the individuals went on to set up a new company, Tutor, which is still running. It's had a bit of a rocky few years recently, but again, working in wireless communications. So what we see in the story of Pye is two things. One, we see a company that has evolved and changed over time. But the second thing we also see is this kind of start of this network effect. How Pye in itself, maybe the story has ended, but how actually the impact and the growth of the venture has continued within the cluster, given rise to new companies. So this is a little bit of the story of perhaps of examples of, the first companies, the first technology companies within the Cambridge cluster. But if we actually want to understand how what is known as the Cambridge cluster today came about, we have to look forward a little bit in time. And there's been a lot of work into this simply because there is a lot of interest from governments and policymakers to understand, how do technology clusters grow? How can we create these environments that nurture entrepreneurship? It's really quite difficult to pinpoint the origins of Cambridge cluster. It's a little bit like one of those stories where everybody wants to be the one who started it. Everybody wants to be the person who created it. And the truth is, like many things in history, it's a little bit more muddled, it's a little bit more unclear. Now, the cluster as we know it today really started kicking off in the 1960s. But at the time, it was an interesting time in terms of there was still quite a divide between what we call town and gown, something that's also referred to actually, in fact, with Oxford. But you have the town, which is the businesses, the people living here, and then you have the gown, which is the university with its academics and its students. And at the time, there was still very much a split between the town and gown in terms of attitudes. And there was still a real attitude within the university that, well, business was not something you kind of did. There are perhaps two things that really caused a shift in attitude. In 1960, we see 3 Cambridge alumni going off and setting up a company called Cambridge Consultants. We see a very early picture here of them with their first staff. Cambridge Consultants was a very simple idea, but quite a groundbreaking one at the time. You know, we have all these great Cambridge minds, these innovators, these cutting edge researchers. If we can just put these minds to the brains of Cambridge to the use of industry. And that was Cambridge Consultants, innovation consultancy, and they are still going strong today. My favorite story about one of their inventions is that they were approached by one of the biggest tea making companies in the UK. And they were currently 4th in terms of popularity, and they really wanted to sell more tea. So they approached Cambridge Consultants with the simple idea of, well, we'd like something to sell more tea. And the answer simply was the invention of the round tea bag. So going back to the 1960s, we see first the start of increasing numbers of companies coming out of mainly the alumni of the university, setting up these new companies. But the big problem at this time was, well, where do they set up? You've got a city council and a university who are still very conservative when it comes to business, not exactly keen to encourage it. And many of these businesses were actually setting up in the back rooms of people's houses. The stories of Cambridge Consultants that, you know, as they grew, they had to move into the garden shed. In 1969, though, there was something that changed all of that with the publication of the Mott Report, a policy report by central government that discussed and recognized the economic impact of entrepreneurship, of technology clusters and of technology ventures. And working alongside of the then bursar of Trinity College, they set up the UK's first science park. We see it here today. It's still growing, Cambridge Science Park. It's been hugely successful, not just because Trinity had a plot of land on the outskirts of Cambridge and set up the science park, which allowed companies like Cambridge Consultants to have the premises to grow and innovate. In 1987, so one thing you have to understand about Cambridge is we have all these colleges, and sometimes these colleges can get very competitive with one another. The richest is Trinity, but the second richest is St. John's. And so in 1980s, St. John's set up its own science park on the other side of the road from Trinity and set up St. John's Innovation Centre, which was actually Europe's first incubator in 1987. We have nicely here, cutting edge architecture at the time. One of the interesting things still though, even as late as 1987, St. John's Incubator is actually built on the outskirts, sorry, phone call, on the outskirts of the city boundaries. It's not actually built in Cambridge City itself because the city council wouldn't give them planning permission. And there are quite a few jokes because based on the kind of taxes from that alone, they really did miss out. And really it is those changes in the 1960s and 70s that we see that there's a real change, to providing simply the premises for companies to take part in, but also just a change to mindset. And I think that's the most important thing about the Cambridge cluster, was really how come the 80s and 90s, and even my time here in Cambridge, about 10 years or so, how the mindset has become to really, really embrace entrepreneurship within the cluster. So what I want to look at now is just to one example in particular of how you take an idea that came out of the university and how actually it's ended up with what is an idea that really has changed the world. And focusing just on this one here, the third one down, we have a venture called ARM. Some of you may have heard of it. Some of you may not. If you are actually watching this on a personal device, on a phone, you will actually have an ARM chip in your hands. Now, if we actually trace back to kind of 1950s, when we have the Cambridge University embarked on the growth path that really would lead Cambridge University to be cutting edge in terms of computing. Maurice Wilkes and his colleague built what was known as the EDSAC. There's a picture here of it, this giant thing, which is a general purpose computer. They're not the first. I believe it's actually Manchester was the first one. But the big difference with what Wilkes and Co. did compared to other researchers working in this area was they actually allowed other colleagues from other disciplines to work with them and use this. And this had two effects on the thing. Firstly, it led to scientific breakthroughs, but also it really established Cambridge as leading edge in terms of kind of personal computer application. And we can see that in the rise of ARM. So ARM actually comes out of a story of a business that was in the end not such a big success. In 1979, we have Chris Curry and Herman Hauser set up Acorn Computers. They're here, pictured here, looking nice and young. Both of them are still, Herman is still very active in the cluster today. The reason they named it Acorn was because it was ahead of Apple in the alphabet. And perhaps their greatest success story was something called the BBC Micro. If you're English and you grew up in the 80s, you may very well remember this. It was a personal computer. They had one at my primary school. It used to live on a trolley and we moved from classroom to classroom. And it was a huge success. Co-branding with the BBC. It was a really big impact in the market. However, the big problem for Acorn was that they soon found themselves behind in the curve. Whereas other companies were innovating in terms of processor power, they were still behind. This is a real era where you see that the big innovations about trying to make computers go faster and faster, which is not what they had. It was also about this time, though, that the story goes that at one point someone walked into a room and said, "What are you guys doing?" And there was a group working on something quite different at the time. While the rest of the world was focusing on making chips faster and faster, they were just focusing on making chips more power, less power, using less power and making less heat. Now at the time, this doesn't appear so useful, but given the rise of the Internet of Things and of mobile phones, you can see exactly why this became such a huge success. ARM spun out in 1990 with 12 employees. They took the ARM chip. But the other thing that's really important about the ARM story is they also did another thing very differently. Their business model. During this time, most computer companies were trying to, they would make their own silicon chips. They didn't just design them, they also manufactured them. ARM was very different in terms of they licensed out their chips. They had limited resources. They didn't have the resources to manufacture the chips. They didn't have the factories. But by licensing it out, it meant that they were able to get to market much quicker. It gave them a competitive edge. They could work much more closer with their customers. Their first customer was Texas Instruments in 1994. And their revenues actually doubled year on year after that. 1998 to 2000, they grew and grew. Eventually, they were sold out to SoftBank in 2016 for $23.4 billion. And they continue to employ 4,000 people around the world. This is one of the interesting stories. Often with these companies that grow up in Cambridge, like Arm, they remain part of the ecosystem. They see themselves as a Cambridge-based company, even though they may have been sold out. They are still here, they are still part of the community, they are still working with other ventures. But it's not just Arm, it's not just about the really big success stories. And I wanted to share with you two of my perhaps favorite ones. Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi is a small microcomputer. And this came out of, in 2009, it came out of the brainchild of two individuals who were, what they saw was that year on year, the number of people applying for computer science degrees was falling. And one of the things they saw was that, these people weren't getting hands-on experience with computing, they weren't programming. And they were like, wouldn't it be great if we could put a computer in the hands of every individual who wanted to apply, so they could actually put and test these ideas and work on it. And hence the Raspberry Pi was born. It was priced under $25, and this is about true to scale on mine, so it's about kind of 20 centimeters big. And Raspberry Pi have grown and grown. The most recent one, the Raspberry Pi Zero here, is smaller than a $5 bill and actually is priced lower than $5 as well. The idea behind this is very good for using within embedded projects. The other great thing about Raspberry Pi as a story is that it is not actually a for-profit business. Raspberry Pi is a foundation, and all the profits go back into the foundation for educational projects around the world, supporting students in developing economies, giving out Raspberry Pis to school to encourage more people to go down the computing and really fulfilling the original vision of Raspberry Pi. Another kind of one that's a little bit different is SwiftKey. SwiftKey, some people may use it, it's a different type of typing on your mobile phone. So rather than typing, normally you swipe, and it learns from your habits to actually predict the next words. It was founded in 2008 in the cluster, and it was eventually bought by Microsoft for $250 million. One of the fun facts about SwiftKey was there were originally 3 founders in the early days, but one of the founders, thinking that, well, it's not going anywhere, exited much earlier on, and actually exited the first year. They were born in 2008 and sold his share for actually a bicycle. So, he says he very much regrets that decision today. And the important thing about a cluster is thinking, well, okay, so we have all these successful ventures. What does this mean? What is it that actually makes a cluster? What is it that makes Silicon Fen, as it's often called, work in the way it does? Now we see how it's evolved over time, how we have this knowledge, how we have the rise of a kind of change in mindset. And over time, this is almost like a snowball effect. As we see, the increase in numbers, it all begins to create an ecosystem that is dependent on each other. So there are a couple of different things within this. So perhaps the largest pull is the entrepreneurs themselves. We've talked about a couple of those success stories of Arm. There are others like CSR, which is working in Bluetooth technology, or we also have some in biotech as well. And the thing about these entrepreneurs is they are still very much active within the ecosystem. in two ways. One, mentoring and supporting the next generation, often setting up, second, third, and fourth companies themselves, but also becoming, in a way, angel investors. So not only are they investing in the next generation, both in terms of support, but also in providing the funding and collateral and resources for other companies to grow. The other player within the system, and quite small because of its kind of very interesting relationship to the cluster, is the universities. And the universities providing ideas, providing often the alumni, the staff. With such a knowledge-intensive industry, this requires really, really high-skilled individuals. One of the interesting figures I always feel about the university is the number of individuals who graduate from Cambridge and actually stay in the local area. I personally have friends of mine who did their PhDs here, who are still working here in startup ventures as well as established organizations. We discussed briefly about governments. So we have the policy changes of the 1960s, which resulted in eventually mindset changes in terms of recognizing the economic impact and the positive impacts early stage ventures can have. And we also have, perhaps not the scale of, say, Silicon Valley, but a growing number of venture capital investors. And these are really crucial in terms of growing companies bigger. And one thing I have noticed is this is probably one of the areas that is most growing at the moment. Seeing the setting up of new venture capital funds within Cambridge, as kind of the venture capitalists are coming here because they're seeing the innovation, they're seeing these success stories, and they're seeing the possibilities. And there are also things like the other services, so professions, accountants, the kind of things that often you won't, with an early stage venture, want to do yourself when you will need to outsource in some way. So within the ecosystem, it is the playing of these kind of different players within the system. A more recent kind of development as well is, as the cluster effect has kind of snowballed and grown, is we've seen that huge number of companies at the beginning of the talk here. But we've also seen a lot more of the companies coming and moving here. Big companies like GlaxoSmithKline, AstraZeneca are currently just about finishing off their European headquarters. But other players like Samsung and Amazon. Samsung and Amazon both actually acquired companies in Cambridge and then was able to move into the ecosystem. It's kind of like they see the party going on here, they see these companies innovating, and they want to be here working alongside these companies, trying to spot the next kind of big thing. Amazon, actually, the reason they moved here was Alexa. The technology behind Alexa was actually developed and invented in Cambridge. And when it was eventually exited and acquired by Amazon, they moved their headquarters here. We also have Apple and Microsoft Research, which is down by the train station. All kind of running events, supporting, being involved in the accelerators, trying to stay ahead of that cutting edge research. Now, one final kind of slide in terms of kind of understanding a little bit more about the companies and the flavor. And this map here on the left-hand side is from a website called Cambridge Cluster Map. I've actually included a link at the bottom if you want to go online. It's an interactive website, and you can go online and you can look at all the different companies that are there in the cluster. And this was actually some work done by the executive director of the Entrepreneurship Centre, and I said it was really interesting, and I wanted to kind of have this glance at these statistics. And what we see is, in terms of the number of startups down here, we have over 4,000. That's a huge number. Total turnover of about 1.21 billion, and total employees just over 8,000. So that's roughly 2 employees per company. These are really early stage ventures, and this is a really amazing figure because it really shows where the cluster is heading in terms of growth. I mean, this is the future of the Cambridge cluster, and I mean, that's just a huge number. We then see just over 500 Cambridge-based companies that are kind of starting up, really going. They, probably VC funded, seed round funded, and 537 with a total employees at 24,000. So still quite a good number. Whether this is slightly a delayed effect, the difference in number, but also probably a drop-off effect as individuals close down in between these stages. Now at the top, we see only 41. These are the really big companies, like, for example, Arm, which we've discussed before, with a total turnover of 8 billion. These are the real kind of larger companies of the cluster. However, in this middle, in the scale up, there's a lot fewer. Now, there are a couple of things we can see from this. One, we can see a really active startup community, which is amazing. We can see a certain number scaling up and growing, but then there seems to be a bit of a gap here. And this is one thing in Cambridge that we don't seem to have so much of. I generally think this is probably one of two reasons. One is the required capital to grow this. Often companies will go international at this stage. But also the second thing is that we have a lot of companies that grow to a certain size and then they exit. For example, SwiftKey earlier, which exited for $250 million. And so we see that a lot of companies will reach this stage, but very few will actually keep growing until the larger stage. And I know this is a conversation I find very interesting in terms of the cluster. Whether is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Is it a bad thing that these companies are not growing, or is it a good thing that a lot of these, if they're exiting, it means that their money is coming back for future investments. These entrepreneurs perhaps are going back into the system. I know personally from a lot of startup stories, often these individuals may exit, but that's just venture one. And then they go and come back and they do it again and they do it again. And they continue doing this. And it's continuing to kind of grow this number at the bottom. The innovations, the talent pool keeps growing. Now, really what I wanted to do, we've looked at the history and we've looked at a few examples of the companies in the cluster. But what's the benefit of all of this? What does this mean, all these stories, all this context? And when I've stood back and thought about it, I've said, well, there are three things that really set Cambridge apart. It's the people, it's the ideas, and it's the support network. And it is the kind of ecosystem working with all three of these things that make it a really special place in terms of entrepreneurship. Now, we had the story of these ventures starting up, and we've had the stories of Arm. And as I've mentioned earlier on, what often happens is that you will get an individual. So we have here Acorn Hermann Hauser. I do apologize for this graphic. It's slightly out of date, but it is some research that was done that really did show about the characteristics of the cluster and the importance of people and networking. And how, when you have an individual like Herman who set up Acorn Computers, the story never stops there. And I've lost count of how many businesses Hermann Hauser has been involved with, but it's in the hundreds, where he's been either on the board or one of the co-founders, and it continues and continues. And so we see him being involved in companies again and again. So right here we have Amadeus Capital Partners, which is one of the VC firms active within the cluster still today. And this is still the story of how just taking one company, Acorn Computers, how the original members of that founding team went on to contribute to business after business after business. We have David Cleveley down here, who's another key name in the Cambridge cluster. I've often heard these people referred to as almost the godfathers of the Cambridge cluster in terms of the way they have been so impactful on generation after generation of company. Some more recent research I've seen is kind of what does it look like today? And while this has continued, there has actually also been a growing amount of talents coming into this pool as well. So in a way, there have been new starts and new individuals contributing to creating this. So it kind of exponentially keeps growing and growing. And these people are a really key component of the ecosystem in Cambridge. They are a key benefit. They are mentors to the next generation. They've been there, they've done that. They're also angel investors. They're also VCs, so they're bringing in funding and financing as well into the cluster. The second thing is ideas. And this is something very particular, especially with a lot of the changing attitudes of the university and as well as government policy. What really sets Cambridge apart is the innovation, is the research and development, the cutting edge technologies that are the companies of the future. And the university has also been getting more and more involved with this. We see Cambridge Enterprise, which is the technology transfer office here at Cambridge, but doing a little bit more. They've set up their own seed funding, and Cambridge University spin-outs have actually raised over $1.5 billion in terms of spin-out seed funding. We see that over kind of 1,600 researchers are being supported by Cambridge Enterprise. What this means is over 1,600 active researchers that are either working in consultancies or working with startups or spinning out their own company in some way. They're being active participants within the cluster. In terms of research excellence, cutting edge research across multiple departments is not just in the sciences, but also in the arts and humanities. And huge amounts of unemployment. And if we just take one example of one department, the Computer University Lab has actually firms founded from alumni, over 250 firms just from one department. And so it is very much this cutting edge research and this innovation that is often at the center of a lot of these firms. Even if on the one hand you get spin-outs, but also you may get companies that grow up on their own from perhaps the students who will go up and set up their own companies in the area. And finally, really, probably the most important thing to someone, like yourself, who's maybe looking at Cambridge, what else is there? And really, it's the support network. None of these things exist on their own. The people are there mentoring and supporting the next generation. The ideas are there in terms of setting up new businesses, in terms of supporting the next generation of businesses. And, just generally looking at what is available out there, there is a growing amount. And this is just kind of a sample of what is organizations that are supporting entrepreneurship in some way or other. So within the university, we have University of Cambridge Enterprise, which is technology transfer. It's supporting the academics to set up their own companies or to spin out or in terms of doing consultancy. We also have student groups like Cambridge University Entrepreneurs, or more recently, the Entrepreneurial Postdocs of Cambridge. They represent the postdoctoral community of Cambridge. We also have Innovation Forum, QTech, the Institute for Manufacturing, which is based out of the West Cambridge site, which have a real interest in the commercialization of technology. An organization that just represents alumni entrepreneurs, so just the alumni. And also, obviously, we have the Judge Business School. Within the Business School, we have the Entrepreneurship Center. The Entrepreneurship Center runs programs like the Masters and the Postgraduate Diploma in Entrepreneurship, but we also run multiple other programs. For example, Enterprise Tuesday, which is a lecture series that happens 2 months a year, with very much the idea of getting people together, as well as getting people thinking about entrepreneurship, perhaps those who are thinking, well, maybe this is something for me. right through to events like Ignites, which happen every summer as a summer school. So the centre is really set up in many ways to support entrepreneurs from the beginning right through actually to scale up. We also have the Centre for Social Innovation, which is supporting social ventures. They have an incubator as well as a master's program, as well as a lot of outreach events. Outside the university, there is many other organizations, and we would be here for a very long time if I was to list them all. So, going very quickly, in the bottom, we have funding. So we have everything from Cambridge Angels, which is an organization that represents all the angels within the Cambridge area. We have Cambridge Innovation Capital, VC fund, and the other end of the spectrum, we have Syndicate Room, which is an equity crowdfunding platform that actually was set up by 2 alumni of the Judge Business School. And we also have so many accelerators, incubators, networks. St. John's Innovation Centre, perhaps the first one. Eagle Labs, providing office space, providing support. Alia is a social innovation incubator, so again, providing office space, providing mentorship programs, and also accelerators like Incubite, which is run out of the Bradfield Centre. So you see a large number of organizations, and it's really interesting because often with newer startups, when you hear their story about how they've grown, it's, they may have started somewhere within the university, and maybe they've attended one of our talks, but they often end up somewhere based at Eagle Labs and maybe going through Syndicate Room for funding. Most journeys involve actually tapping into different bits of these resources from different parts of the community. So you see this kind of network of support that is integrated, and people pick and choose in a way. So to really sum up, and we've kind of been on this long journey right from the 19th century to today, you see the evolution of a system that is integrated and grows and snowballs as the support continues. So you have the people, and I always think it's really important to start with those people. You have the academics who are providing the knowledge. You have the entrepreneurs who are setting up businesses and continuing to support and learning the skills and abilities to continue to set up new ventures, as well as supporting new generations of entrepreneurs. You also have the students active in their own communities, running their own organizations, and perhaps graduating and setting up their own companies, or even just working in startups. And the peer support as well of each other. The ideas, which are coming out of university research, but you also have ideas coming from ventures. And that includes those bigger ones like the likes of AstraZeneca, Microsoft, but also the small ventures as well. The chances are you want to be based somewhere where you have the other ventures that you need to work with to gain skills and knowledge. Perhaps your first customers are all located here together. And then finally, you have the support network that grows out of this. You have the incubators, the accelerators, the VCs, the student societies. Actually, one thing I didn't mention, you have colleges as well, which are increasingly setting up their own entrepreneurial communities within their own colleges and the networks. And then very sneakily, we have obviously the Entrepreneurship Centre, and we aim to be kind of trying to link as much of this together and trying to work with as many of these organizations together. So to sum up, really, the key benefits of the Cambridge cluster is the people, the ideas, and the support that you can get. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry, my voice has been getting croakier and croakier. If you have any questions at all, we have about 15 minutes left. So, I'd love to hear from you. So I'm just going to turn the slides off, and please do feel free to type any questions in the box. So, Okay. Okay, so Dr. Roland P. Ducorte, can I call you Roland? Is that okay? So yeah, I kind of know your feeling. I'm actually a humanities graduate myself, and it's something I kind of feel quite passionate about. I would say it depends what stage you're at in terms of getting first steps to get more involved. I know that we're running a program within the centre actually that we're trying to get more individuals from the arts and humanities involved. So I would say as a first step, look at the Judge Business School Entrepreneurship Centre page to look at the various different programs and what works for you. As an additional step, I'm more than happy if you want to drop me an email and I can try and put you in touch, maybe with someone who might be of relevant to kind of actually help out and see if there's something we can, would fit well. So, one, look at the website in terms of the programs of support. As a PhD student, there's a lot there that is open to you regardless of what department you're in. And secondly, do get in contact and I can see if I can put you in touch with anybody who kind of more directly can help out. Most of the sales that close joint businesses. Oh, why do I think that the information sector? I I think this is probably due primarily to the types of companies that were there first. In terms of the early innovations that were growing in markets, even we look at Pi Instruments, for example, they were in wireless computing, CSR and ARM. It was very much due to what was cutting edge innovation at the time. One of the things, I don't know if I went over it in too much depth, was that one of the things we've actually seen more recently is that an explosion in the biotech and the healthcare and the life sciences. This is growing at a much, much faster rate right now. So while the information system sector, I think, had an early start, which kind of gave it that kind of curve, we're seeing biotech now actually growing quite steadily and quite at an increase. And actually, the other area also is agritech. We're seeing that increasingly grow. Yeah, I would say simply probably the information sector was because the early innovations that were commercialized were simply in that area. So we built a competency in that area, which ended up with more ventures being set up. And only more recently has kind of the biotech kind of got on board, and that's really, really growing quite quickly. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's a really interesting one actually, and one that good research question. Okay, social entrepreneurship at Cambridge. There is a real, actually, I think, growing amount of social entrepreneurship. We have several different organizations. I know that within the Entrepreneurship Centre, we don't have so much of focus on it, but we have supported many, many entrepreneurs through it. I know today there was an article on the Judge Business School about one of the alumni to the postgraduate diploma in entrepreneurship, in fact, who set up an organization called Footprints Cafe, which is a cafe that works with local communities to give them jobs and employment. And she set up her first one in Cambodia and is now moving on to setting up at multiple different sites. So we do support social enterprises in that way. I think much more on a big scale, we do have the Centre for Social Innovation who do a lot of really cool things. They run an incubator program and they also run their own masters. Their masters is much more linked to academically looking at social innovation. But there are actually quite a few organizations going on. Another good organization to look at in terms of social entrepreneurship is ALIA. Alia also run programs. They run a program which is directly meant for social entrepreneurship. They also have a couple of smaller accelerator projects run out of EU funding as well. So sometimes they're a good one to look at if you're looking for funding in terms of social accelerators. So there's a lot out there. And I would say, therefore, the two key places to look at is please look at the Centre for Social Innovation in terms of the work they're doing. I think what I'll do at the end is I'll pass on a few links to Laura that can be sent out. And it's also worth looking at Alia. Their CEO used to actually be a mentor on the postgraduate diploma in entrepreneurship, a gentleman called Tim Jones, who is really, really, amazing in terms of mentoring social entrepreneurship ventures. Could you please provide some okay, Christian Lou, so you're asking me, can I provide some concrete examples of how the program interacts with the cluster? Okay, so firstly, we talked about the people, and I think this is a really key point of one way that the diploma works with the cluster. So we have the mentors on the program. These are people that come from the cluster. In other ways, they are interacting with the program. This year I was teaching the Lean Startup, and I did a couple of videos. And as part of my research project, I am following about 40 very early stage ventures. And so what I did was actually, for some of the material, I went and did videoing of some of the entrepreneurs I'm working with. So we're actually talking and discussing and bringing those entrepreneurs in a way into the virtual classroom. So mentors, introducing you to these companies. We've also had things like at some of the dinners, afternoon dinner speeches. So one of the more recent dinners, we had one of the founders of ARM came and talked about the setting up ARM and about his journey, his entrepreneurial journey. So as much as possible, we introduce you to the cluster. We're actually doing a lot more work to try and bring in even more organizations to allow you those networking chances to meet those people. The other way is really introducing you to the various support by talking to you. And, this is very individually dependent on what do you need, because every individual's journey is going to be so different. And, it may be a matter of, introducing you to someone who may be a co-founder. It may be a matter of kind of at least opening doors and pointing you in the right direction of where you can find the information you need. One of the things that we're really keen to push is the fact that it's like any network. There is so much kind of that we can do as a diploma, but there's also so much that you can do in terms of kind of putting yourself out there and reaching out and taking advantage of the cluster. I mean, there is so much out there that is just at your fingertips in a way, but does mean that you also have to reach out. I would say the third thing is that for anybody thinking of attending the program, there are a lot of the other events going on that you are open to attend. There are a lot of open lectures in the wider university that you can attend, but there are things like Enterprise Tuesday within the centre that you are free to attend. We have also the accelerator within the Judge Business School, which you can apply for. So it opens multiple different kind of pathways to that support as well. Does that answer your question, Christian? Or was there anything in particular that you were kind of interested in? Are there any other questions at all? What about housing development industry? What do you mean by housing development, Christian? Could you be a little bit more specific? I mean, just while you're maybe being more specific, Christian, the one thing I can say is we do have, yeah, so okay, so I would say the main interest to you is probably the fact that we do have within the program, we do have a pathway which specializes in construction. Um, I will completely admit that as anybody, I specialize in a few industries, and this is not my specialist area of knowledge. I do know that there are a number of housing organizations within the cluster, like any other area, but I would say probably in terms of the program, the best way to be keyed on is really working through that pathway leader who would be an expert in that industry, and really linking you then to the right people rather than perhaps myself, who's not an expert at all in the construction industry. So I would say that is the main thing within the program which would really support in that area for that specific need rather than the general need. So any last minute questions before we sign off today? We've got a couple more minutes if you want to ask anything about the cluster, or perhaps you have an interesting observation that I have not made that you would like to share. How many of the companies in the cluster are female co-founders? I love the question, Lorraine. Okay, how long do we have? I have no idea, is the answer to the question. I can talk a little bit about diversity within the cluster, as this is something that is quite close to my own heart. Unfortunately, the reality is that any tech cluster is extraordinarily male dominated. One of the things that really nags me about the slide when I show you about the early generation of those companies is how there's only one female name on that slide. You know, I hear about the stories in Silicon Valley, which kind of are just dreadful in terms of the issues at play. I would say, though, on a really positive note, I think the Cambridge cluster is a lot more open to women co-founders and is much more diverse. I think it's getting a lot more diverse in terms of companies growing with female co-founders, in terms of women that I hear doing entrepreneurship. I always go back to I have my research project where I'm working with about 40 early stage ventures, and I have quite a few women in that sample, and it's very rare that I actually hear from them that they're having issues beyond, unfortunately, the normal in terms of being female co-founders. I would also say that one thing in Cambridge that there is also a lot of support for women. There are a couple of women-only networking groups. What you think of that is always controversial, but the other thing we do is we have an event, we have a program within the school called Enterprise Women. We also have a leadership conference every year for women in leadership. So we have a couple of key individuals within the judge working in terms of female entrepreneurship and also female leadership. So I cannot answer your question directly, but the one thing I would say is there is a very open-mindedness to diversity in the cluster. I think one of the things I've really noticed about Cambridge as a cluster and companies within Cambridge is it almost doesn't matter who you are, because it's very kind of high knowledge, if you understand what I mean. It's very technology driven. You know, you're dealing with a lot of people with very, who are geniuses often within your field. One of the things I always find really funny about Cambridge is you can literally stumble over Nobel Prize winners. I've done this in the street where I have walked past someone and suddenly realized he's a Nobel Prize winner. And I feel like it's often what gets you ahead is really being passionate about a subject or about a cause, and that's what people really care about. And actually the diversity thing then almost naturally happens, because the best way to real innovation is actually having diversity. And I think in terms of the entrepreneurial cluster, in the last 10, 20 years, we're seeing a real shift, and we're seeing a lot more diversity within the cluster. We're seeing a lot more startups having mixed teams. We're seeing a lot more startups having women-only teams. So I don't know how many, but I do know that it is increasing year on year. No worries, Lorraine. I could have talked about that for like an hour. So, um, okay, someone was typing. Okay, well, as there are no more questions, I think I will sign off there. Oh, wait, I'll just say this while you're typing, Roland. The two things I will do is I will send Laura a couple of links in terms of organizations and areas of, based on the questions where you'd like to look for more information. Thanks for the talk, and I'm sure it'll be uploaded. So I'll ask Laura to pass on those links to yourselves. And really, just thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. It's a subject I've always find kind of very interesting, looking at kind of the history of the cluster and trying to kind of understand how it's all changing and is changing. So, and if you do have any more questions at all, please do share them. Either get in contact with myself. I will let Laura pass on my contact details, or do ask any member of the team. But thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.